point. So I wouldn't have, I'm not an enthusiast of values, but I've never seen those. What are they anyway? But so that's, but I address that because Aleksi addressed that, and because I hear the value talk all over the place. And I feel that it's expected of the opponents to say something. There's a big hype around the TTIP. So people feel that we are so threatened. You know, the Chinese are there and they have different color norms, and there's the Islamic State is over there, and we are falling, and all the good European white middle class values, we have to stick to those. And so I hear that. I mean, nobody is saying that, but everybody is meaning that. So I hear that, and I want to say, well, actually, I hate those values. If that's what you stand for, I'm not with you. So I think, let's put that aside for a second. So then there's the second argument about this international standard, that the good guys in this world, the United States and Europe, should once again think of themselves as imperial standards. And so the idea of there being an international minimum standard, just a little bit of a lesson in public international law history. So the idea of there being an international minimum standard is a 19th century idea which was developed in the 1870s, 1880s by American lawyers when American businesses in Central and Latin America were threatened by revolution and by mismanagement and by all kinds of problems that the Americans thought resulted from the underdeveloped nature of the South. And so they thought, well, we have to civilize these guys, and we have to bring them to civilized principles of business behavior, etc. And so they imposed on Latin American states, in Mexico especially, international arbitral systems in which tens of thousands of American businessmen were able to make complaints, and then those complaints were dealt with under an international minimum standard, which was a standard which was developed in Washington, D.C. As the civilized Western standard. And that, at once upon a time, then towards the end of the 19th century, became anathema, even in the Western Hemisphere. And the Latin Americans, so in Argentina and Brazil, developed what they call the Calvo doctrine, the doctrine that if you deal with us, then you deal with us on the basis of our domestic laws. Even if you're American, even if you're white and middle class, you have to be just to follow the rules of the country in which you live. And of course the Americans were terribly antagonized, and the Europeans were as well, because they had always set the rules themselves. That had been the world history was like that. And then there was the 20th century where most of this, you couldn't really speak this out. You could run this, but you couldn't speak. Until in 1960s or so, the developing countries became independent, and once again the Europeans faced the problem that they are nationalizing our companies, the British Petroleum and Texaco and Aramco. Around 1960, a series of controversial nationalizations of Western extractive industry companies. And it was at that point when the West took the matter to the World Bank and developed this system which is now proposed to us as the well-functioning international legal system of investment protection, which historically speaking is a neo-colonial concoction, continuation of the Western imperial effort to set standards for everyone. I'll come back to the values. So I look at this talk from that historical perspective. And it's true, it's a historical perspective. It looks backwards. Because I think the world is a disaster, and it didn't become a disaster yesterday. It became a disaster because of the way we in the West have behaved in the course of some centuries, basically from 1492 onwards. And so all this talk about values and the West setting the good standards, we've heard this. We heard this when the Spaniards went to Americas. We heard this when the Americans, when the British went to Northern America. We've heard this from colonialists when King Leopold went to the Congo. So he was civilizing the Congo too. And we hear this today. Now, it's very impolite to talk in these terms outside the walls of a university. If I were to talk this way, for instance, in the next foreign ministry meeting on the TTIP, etc., people will look at me and say, well, Martti, we don't speak in those terms here. But this is an academic and an intellectual environment. One is entitled to think slightly outside the box, slightly outside the 5 minutes of politics that we have now on the table. So values, yes, I think there are values out there. I think if the world economic system seems like a disaster, it has become a disaster because there's a history to it. It's a history of values, it's a history of power, it's a history especially in which power has expressed itself in the language of values. And if I'm against the idea that America and Europe stand for some single thing, it is because I'm against the idea that the perpetuation of Western dominance over others should be dressed in this language of technical investment protection.
Thank you for your
Well, so I gather that you would support the Chinese agreement without any reference to workers' rights or environmental standards, instead of a TTIP or TPP agreement, which has ILO core labor standards and minimum standards of environmental protection.
Well, I would want to put that question in a larger frame. And of course, one has to be strategic. One needs to look at the present, and one needs to think in a larger historical frame. If there's no reason in being dogmatic about the strategic choices that we have, and if we are able to protect some people who need protection, advanced interests that are important interests, we should do that. But we should always ask, well, with what cost? In this fear of China, I hear a lot of racism. Racism is an old European story. We shouldn't be too shocked when we meet up with racism. It comes with, pinstripe suits and ties, etc. So I recently read an article on Chinese investment in Africa. And I've heard from the EU side a lot of critical remarks as to now the Chinese are enslaving the Africans, etc. Why is it that the Africans aren't complaining? Well, but the Europeans, of course, know best. So in this article, what attached my interest was especially the fact that there are 2.5 million African small businesses that have been set up. These are small businesses conducted by families, by Chinese families. They send much of the money back to China, to the small villages where the families come from, but some of the money also stays in the African village. Now these are investors and economic operators who do not demand that the Africans will have to immediately follow up with Western labor standards or Western environmental standards, and Africans feel fine. Africans feel, well, we set the standards we want here. And we need to negotiate with the Chinese. The Chinese and the Africans have both had experience of what it is to be ruled by Europeans. They don't, and the one thing that they have taken from that experience is that we don't want to be like they were. And I find it marvelous to see small Chinese businesses set themselves up in Tanzania, for instance, or Egypt. Or if you go to Venice nowadays, to look at the tourist quarters in Venice, you see small Chinese leather shops in Venice, owned by small companies. It's true again that a lot of the money goes back to the families in Chinese countryside, but I don't see this. And then I see this on the one hand, and then I see these enormous Western companies, and I think, well, I know where my solidarity lies at that point. So it's a complex issue. And of course, I am not saying that, well, we should no longer care about workers' rights if the Chinese do not work. I think we're crazy for it today. It's just that one should be strategic. One should look at what's there on the table, what can one achieve in this negotiation here, what are the dangers, while doing that, however, not to fall into the to the trap of thinking that everything I now represent in this institution of mine, in this negotiation, embodies the whole of the scope of values available. No, we can achieve small things only in small contexts. Think big, act small.
Just to correct one thing, we're not talking about Western values when we are talking about the ILO, for example. The ILO is a UN body, and we are talking about standards set at the UN at the global level. And same goes with global environmental standards.
Okay, thank you to the speakers and for the question. I believe we have a question here at the back.
Professor Koskenniemi, you're clearly a very civilized man. The question I was asked was that you have talked a lot about values between Europe and the United States, whether you agree with them, whether we agree with our values. But the question was that you talked not maybe too much about the values, and it was asked for a very specific answer to what has been said, that maybe you are looking to the past when you talk about the investment protection being such a big risk. And I'm very concerned with the investment protection, but I would very much like to hear your opinion very briefly about whether you are looking to the past and why you may not be looking to the past and why it still is a problem.
So I'm not absolute. So you want me to give my view on the ISDS proposition, the proposals that are on the table on the ISDS?
Yes. Do you agree with your opposition that it is going to a good direction and we might not be that we shouldn't maybe be so afraid of it?
Yeah. Well, so the question is whether I would want to compromise. Why would I compromise? So I have a good solution. We go with the domestic courts. And if then the treaty as a